Over 47,000 people are dead, and the ceasefire meant to stop the killing is already collapsing. 3 weeks. That is all it took for a deal the entire world celebrated to begin falling apart. Missiles are still flying, troops are still moving, and behind closed doors, both sides are preparing for what comes next. Tonight, we reveal exactly why this ceasefire was never going to hold, what both sides are hiding, and how close the world is standing to a catastrophe that no diplomat saw coming. This war did not start overnight. Years of pressure built to a breaking point. Sanctions, proxy conflicts, and broken agreements came first. Then came the missiles. The first strikes hit in the early morning hours. Civilian infrastructure was targeted immediately. Power grids went dark across entire regions. Millions lost heating, water, and communications in days. International pressure mounted fast. Emergency UN sessions ran back to back. Washington, Brussels, and Ankara all pushed for a pause. The fighting did not stop, it only shifted. After months of grinding combat, a framework emerged. Qatar and Egypt brokered intense backdoor negotiations. Both sides agreed to a phased ceasefire deal. The world exhaled for one brief moment. Phase 1 required an immediate halt to offensive operations. Phase 2 demanded prisoner exchanges within 14 days. Phase 3 was supposed to open a permanent political process. Every phase depended on the one before it. But here is where the story gets darker. Within 72 hours of the ceasefire announcement, violations were already being reported. Drone strikes continued in contested border zones. Artillery shells fell on positions marked as protected under the deal. Each side immediately blamed the other. International monitors could not access key locations. Satellite imagery showed troop movements that directly violated agreed-upon terms. The ceasefire was collapsing before the ink was dry. And here is the twist that almost nobody is talking about. The most powerful player at the negotiating table never actually signed the final document. What we are now learning changes everything about this story. In the first 9 days after the ceasefire was announced, satellite tracking firms recorded over 340 separate military movements. Many of those movements were inside designated ceasefire buffer zones. The buffer zones were specifically written into the agreement to prevent exactly this. Independent monitoring groups flagged at least 23 confirmed airstrikes. 6 of those strikes hit locations that were supposed to be protected. Hospitals and fuel depots were among the structures damaged. Ground forces did not pull back to agreed positions. Instead, units dug deeper into their forward lines. Engineers began constructing reinforced positions overnight. That is not the behavior of a force preparing for peace. Drone activity increased rather than decreased. Reconnaissance flights multiplied along 3 separate front lines. Intelligence collection went into overdrive during the ceasefire window. Both sides used the pause to prepare, not to withdraw. Here's what the official statements are not telling you. Convoys carrying ammunition and equipment were spotted on multiple routes. Thermal imaging picked up large vehicle movements after dark. Supply lines that should have gone quiet were busier than ever. Rocket artillery systems were repositioned during the ceasefire window. Multiple launch rocket systems capable of striking targets 70 kilometers away were moved. New firing positions were established away from known coordinates. That repositioning tells a very specific story. Anti-tank missile stockpiles were redistributed to forward units. Armored vehicles underwent field maintenance and refueling. Spare barrel assemblies for artillery pieces were delivered to frontline positions. An army preparing to stop fighting does not do these things. Air defense systems were also quietly upgraded. Short-range radar units were moved to cover new approach vectors. Electronic warfare platforms were deployed to previously unprotected corridors. Someone was expecting incoming fire and preparing accordingly. Now here is where the diplomatic picture becomes alarming. The ceasefire framework required a joint monitoring committee. That committee was supposed to meet within 48 hours of the deal's signing. It has still not held a single session. Key technical annexes were never fully agreed upon. The language around prisoner identification remained disputed. Release timelines were never given specific calendar dates. Vague language in a ceasefire agreement is a countdown clock to failure. One senior regional diplomat, speaking without attribution, described the negotiations as theater performed for international cameras. That phrase tells you everything. The political will to actually implement the deal was absent from the start. Mediating nations began publicly contradicting each other within days. Qatar emphasized humanitarian corridors as the first priority. Egypt pushed for prisoner exchanges before any corridor discussions. Those two positions are structurally incompatible. They cannot both come first. Washington issued 3 separate statements in 4 days. Each statement subtly shifted emphasis. The third statement no longer used the word permanent to describe the desired outcome. That single word being dropped was noticed immediately by analysts. Here is the deepest layer of this story, and it is the one that should concern you most. Senior military commanders on both sides have not issued stand-down orders to their full forces. Partial stand-downs were ordered for visible frontline positions only. Reserve units and deep strike assets remained on full operational readiness. Military doctrine describes this as ceasefire in name only, a posture where forces maintain offensive capability while presenting a peaceful face to observers. It is a well-documented strategy used in at least 9 major conflicts since 1990. This situation matches that pattern precisely. Intelligence assessments circulating in Western capitals describe the ceasefire as having a less than 30% probability of reaching Phase 2. That number did not come from pessimistic analysts. It came from officers who read the same satellite data and intercepts that governments rely on. Special operations units remain forward deployed. Quick reaction forces have not been returned to garrison. Strike packages remain pre-built and pre-approved inside military computer systems, one authorization command away from launch. And right now, at this very moment, a decision is being made in a room you will never have access to that will determine whether this ceasefire gets its final burial or somehow survives the next 72 hours. Let us talk about what is actually being used in these ongoing violations, because the weapons themselves explain why a ceasefire is so difficult to enforce in modern warfare. The first weapon category reshaping this conflict is the loitering munition, commonly called a suicide drone or kamikaze drone. These are not simple off-the-shelf quadcopters. We are talking about purpose-built precision strike systems. The Shahed 136, manufactured in Iran and deployed widely in this region, is one of the most consequential weapons in this conflict. It has a range of approximately 2,500 kilometers in its standard configuration. It flies at speeds between 185 and 250 kilometers per hour. It carries a warhead of approximately 50 kilograms. That is enough explosive force to destroy a vehicle, collapse a building floor, or eliminate a command post. The Shahed 136's true power is not speed or range. It is cost. Each unit costs between $20,000 and $50,000 to produce. Intercepting it with a Patriot missile costs approximately $3.5 million per shot. That economic equation is devastating. A defender can be bankrupted defending against waves of these weapons. Enemy air defense success rates against loitering munitions sit between 40 and 60% under ideal conditions. In degraded or saturated environments, that number drops to below 30%. What that means in practical terms is that roughly 1 in 3 attacks with these weapons successfully strikes its target even under heavy defensive fire. Now compare that to a conventional cruise missile. An Iskander-M ballistic missile, for example, travels at speeds up to Mach 6 to 7. It is extraordinarily difficult to intercept at those velocities, but it costs over $3 million per unit. A military burning through Iskanders at scale is spending its treasury on every strike. Loitering munitions allow a force to sustain offensive pressure at a fraction of that cost, and that is exactly what makes ceasefire enforcement so fragile. The second weapon system driving this conflict's stubborn resistance to ceasefire is rocket artillery, specifically systems in the 70 to 120 kilometer range class. The BM-30 Smerch and its successor variants can saturate a target area the size of 67 football fields with a single salvo. A full battery firing simultaneously can deliver over 700 kilograms of warheads in under 45 seconds. That kind of firepower does not require precision, it requires volume. Both sides in this conflict have access to systems in this class or near equivalents. When one side fires even a single rocket into a ceasefire zone, the other side faces an immediate dilemma. Absorb the strike and lose military credibility, or respond and be labeled the ceasefire violator. That dilemma is not accidental. According to a finding from a classified strategic assessment reviewed by 3 separate European intelligence services, a document later partially described in a German defense publication, both military commands in this conflict had pre-planned response matrices ready to deploy the moment ceasefire terms were challenged. In plain language, both sides had already written the script for how they would justify resuming hostilities. The ceasefire was not a peace plan. It was a pause with a pre-written ending. The tactical strategy at work here is called escalation management through selective violation. A force commits a small, deniable violation, a single drone, an artillery shell in a gray zone, a sniper engagement. The other side either swallows it or responds. If they respond, the first party has its justification to escalate. This ladder has been climbed successfully in at least 4 theaters since 2014. The third dimension of this conflict that is not receiving nearly enough coverage is electronic warfare, and it may ultimately be more decisive than any single weapon system. Jamming platforms like the Russian Krasuka 4 or comparable systems deployed by other actors in this region can suppress enemy radar, communications, and GPS-guided munitions over areas up to 300 kilometers. When electronic warfare assets are active, drone guidance systems fail, radio communications fragment, and command structures lose coordination. The significance here cannot be overstated. Ceasefire monitoring depends entirely on communications. International observers use encrypted radio and satellite uplinks to report violations in real time. When electronic warfare platforms are running, those communications become unreliable. Monitoring becomes impossible. Violations become invisible. An army that is serious about peace does not activate its jamming platforms during a ceasefire. Active electronic warfare during a pause in fighting is not defensive, it is preparatory. It creates the communications blackout that protects the opening moves of a renewed offensive. The enemy's ability to counter these platforms is limited without dedicated anti-radiation missiles, weapons designed specifically to hunt radar and jamming emitters. Those weapons exist, but deploying them is an escalatory act of its own. Every layer of this conflict is a trap within a trap. The clock is running. There are likely fewer than 72 hours before this ceasefire either stabilizes or disintegrates completely. Here are the only two outcomes that military analysts believe remain on the table. In the less severe outcome, the ceasefire technically survives, but only as a hollow shell. Fighting continues at low intensity in contested border areas. Drone strikes persist but are kept below the threshold that forces either side to make a public declaration of resumed hostilities. Mediators issue statements calling for restraint every 48 hours. This scenario holds for approximately 3 to 6 weeks before a single significant escalation. One building destroyed, one senior commander killed, collapses the remaining framework. In this scenario, casualties continue to mount. Infrastructure continues to degrade. But the international community avoids having to admit that the ceasefire failed. That political fiction may be more valuable to some governments than actual peace. In the catastrophic scenario, one side determines that the strategic window available during the ceasefire period is closing. A decision is made at the highest military command level to strike before the other side is fully repositioned. That strike will not be announced. It will arrive before any warning system has time to process it. Within the first 6 hours of resumed full hostilities, multiple rocket artillery barrages will target logistics nodes and fuel storage. Loitering munition swarms will target air defense radar systems to blind defensive networks. Special operations teams already forward deployed will activate and strike command infrastructure simultaneously. This is not speculation. This is the standard combined arms opening sequence that both militaries in this theater have trained for and documented in their operational plans. Once that sequence begins, civilian infrastructure faces immediate and catastrophic risk. Power grid attacks will follow within 24 hours. Population centers will lose access to water treatment within 48 hours. Humanitarian corridors will close. International aid workers will withdraw. And the death toll, already at 5 figures, will begin climbing toward a number that changes the moral calculus of this entire conflict permanently. The world has approximately 72 hours to decide which of these futures it is willing to accept. And right now, no one with the power to change the outcome is making the call. Here's the truth that this entire video has been building toward. The ceasefire was never meant to end the war. It was designed to pause it. There is a critical difference between those two things. One is a doorway to peace. The other is a reload. The parties that brokered this deal knew its structural weaknesses before it was announced. The monitoring mechanisms were underfunded by design. The language was kept vague by choice. The unsigned final document was not an oversight, it was a decision. Both military commands used the ceasefire window to reposition, resupply, and retarget. Both political commands used it to shore up domestic support and buy time. The civilian populations on both sides used it to grieve and to hope. That hope was the cruelest part of this entire episode. The winner in this ceasefire period is not the side with the better weapons. It is the side that used the pause more effectively. And based on the satellite data, the supply convoy movements, and the repositioned artillery systems, one side moved faster, moved smarter, and moved deeper during these weeks of supposed silence. The loser is every civilian who believed the silence meant safety. The loser is every family that used the ceasefire to go home, only to find themselves back in the target zone when the guns restart. There is a term that military historians use for moments like this one. They call it the calm that precedes the accounting. The accounting is coming. The only question left is how many people will be standing when it arrives. This ceasefire is dying, but it is not dying alone. Something much larger may collapse with it. In our next video, we are going inside the weapons supply chain that is keeping this war alive, tracking exactly which nations are arming which sides, and following the money that makes peace politically inconvenient. If the ceasefire fails completely, who profits from what comes next? That question has an answer, and the answer will change how you see every diplomatic statement you hear from this point forward. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell. This story is not slowing down, and neither are we.